Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special webinar of the She Network, where today we are joined by a truly trailblazing female leader in our sector. Professor Eunice Simmons is Vice Chancellor and Principal at the University of Chester, and throughout her career has pioneered research in environmental science and has paired this with taking on significant leadership positions at the universities she's been a part of. Her passion for widening participation and equality can be seen in her joint win of the 2023 University Leader of the Year in the Purpose Coalition Awards. And as Chester's first female Vice-Chancellor, she champions female advancement across the institution and values the visibility of female leadership. Joining me in this conversation today is Simone Davies and Louise Wood, trusted founding partners of the She Network, who I know are excited as I am to be a part of this discussion. Eunice, hello, and thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, Marcella, Simone, Louise, and very good to be here.
I remember when we first met, it was an industry awards, and I think something that really stood out to me is how much of your time you gave me listening to my story and sharing yours. And in that moment, you were Deputy Vice Chancellor at Nottingham Trent University. And I'd firstly like to ask, was being a VC always an ambition of yours, and how has your journey getting there been?
Well, it certainly wasn't a sort of ambition from the beginning. I don't think anyone really knows what a vice chancellor is or does, to be fair, particularly until you get a bit higher up in the sector. And indeed, internationally, a vice chancellor is seen as a deputy. So quite a lot of UK vice chancellors call themselves president as well as vice chancellor for that reason. So it wasn't an overarching ambition, but I always knew I enjoyed management. I enjoyed leadership. I knew I wanted to be in education. I started in the schools and I moved into universities because I missed the research side. And I was hugely lucky because I also then played to my other strength, which is working with students and really trying to envisage what experience they get in an institution rather than what we say they get. And I got into that being a residential warden, actually, in my very first career at University of London, my first post. And that's never left me. I've always felt the sort of authenticity of the university experience is something to work at. So being a vice chancellor is one way to try and effect that across the whole institution, I guess.
That's really refreshing to hear because there's obviously in all of our roles, we're always trying to put ourselves in the shoes of students and make sure they get the best experience. Was that a big change for the institutions that you've worked with in the mindset of how they approach things?
Not at the University of London, because I was actually doing a master's with the University of Kent and got to know this London college, which has now been taken over by Imperial out in Kent. And so I was fortunate to work with people who had been in a very significant institution like the University of London, but were in a small collegiate part of it. And so I got to understand the benefits of that. You had the big power of the University of London and the name, but you were in a collegiate environment. So I think what I've tried to do, taking through my career, different institutions, I'm now in my sixth institution, that sort of collegiality for the students. And I think that makes the difference. It was difficult in some places. It wasn't when Imperial took over. That 100% was not their way of being all those years ago. I think they've moved on hugely in 2 decades or more. But it wasn't also necessarily what Nottingham Trent was doing. And yet it became known for that because I had a group of colleagues who, when I started, they completely got it. And we all worked together. And then we got a new vice chancellor who I worked with for 5 years, Edward Peck. And interestingly, he's now a student support person as an advocate for DFE. So we kind of grew that culture, I guess you could say.
And that cultural change, it takes a lot of skill and time. What steps did you take to kind of develop those skills within yourself?
In terms of developing skills within myself, it was paying attention to detail for sure, realizing that not all colleagues naturally held that view. Don't forget, academics go into university for their subject area almost as much as being an educator. And as a manager of academics, you have to understand that and work with it, work with the grain of it, not against it. And I think I've been successful when I've managed to do that. And that was a skill I needed to develop, to stop thinking everybody approached life the same way I did.
I think that's really a lot of our followers work in marketing and communications, and I think that is such good advice when working in a university. It's brilliant, really good.
The title of the webinar today is Being Brave, and hearing you speak then, there's kind of two aspects of that bravery. There's bravery in taking on these positions in your own personal journey, but also bravery in doing things differently and challenging the norm, and really pushing for the best of the institution. How have you harnessed bravery throughout your career, and what does being brave mean to you?
Well, I think being brave, certainly in a man's world, because I've worked in land-based education in forestry. So the Forestry Commission paid for my PhD. So everybody wore green uniforms when I used to go to the research centre. Literally, it was like joining the army. So that was definitely male dominated. Being brave was going into the canteen and not minding that I didn't have a green uniform and I still had as much right to be there as anybody else. I was pretty young then. So that's that difference, that needing to be included and feel equal to other people when they were already in a setup that was established, I guess, with lots of norms. Yeah. So I think being brave is challenging the norms quite often and working on equal terms with people, however long they've been in that particular setting. And then being brave in terms of changing things, I think it's about having enough information behind you to go out and be brave. I think people only feel anxious in leadership positions when they don't have information behind them and they haven't really thought something through and you're going out a bit on spec. You can't do that in a senior job. You have to be really well versed in the detail of what you're going to talk about and take on the different views and talk to people about those different views. And I think being brave, I'm not sure I'd always call it bravery. I think it's called preparedness, really. Means you need to be kind of less brave. You can be confident if you're well prepared.
That does chime with me. I remember I played the piano growing up. I'm not a natural performer of the piano. It's just something that I did and I studied it at university. And if I ever played a piece and I didn't know it inside out and back to front, I was always setting myself up for failure.
Yeah.
And I did. I mean, I've really cocked up many performances over the years, but just hearing you say that, it kind of brought back that memory. And I think that's a great piece of advice because when we're bringing new ideas to the table, when we're trying to do something differently, or as you said, being included, if you are prepared, if you have your argument, your rationale, the detail, it generally tends to go the way you want it to go.
Yeah.
I certainly felt coming into, because University of Chester is my first position within higher ed, and that comment you made sort of resonated in terms of feeling a sense of belonging in terms of in the sector, and I felt like I had a good skill set and good understanding, but all of a sudden there were all these new things to learn and understanding about the student journey and all the acronyms and you suddenly feel a bit so that I felt like I had to be brave in terms of suggesting things and thinking, oh, this might not be a traditional approach, but I think that's what's so brilliant about this sector. And I think I've mentioned it in some webinars before about how actually as a sector, people are really helpful when you get to know people in different institutions or indeed across your own institution and say, oh, does this resonate or does this work? And people say, oh yeah, try this or try a bit of this. So I think actually because we work within education, it's a bit easier to be brave and to come up with new ideas because we should all, excuse the pun, constantly be learning. But I think there's definitely that sense of that really hit home, that sense of belonging and feeling that you owe, you're justified to be sat at that table, as it were, I think.
Looking back, is there any advice that you would give to yourself on the journey that you kind of know now? It'd be great if you could share any examples.
Gosh, I would have felt, yes, I would have felt more confident about things like publishing if I had had people around me who really understood the publishing journey. As it was, I ended up in a way giving up some publications which I'd done the lead work on, and in the end I got a sort of mention instead of the name on it because I didn't really realize in my first couple of years the significance of that. So I think that's a particular one to academia, but what that really represents is knowing what's important in that setting. So I didn't necessarily understand the significance. I also always thought there was enough time to do everything. And so I'd always do it better if I did it later or went and looked at it again. Actually, now I realise that it's better just to get on and achieve something rather than end up with a whole drawer full of things which you're intending to do better at some mythical time in the future, which never arrives. So the things I've done best at, the things I've just grasped, got on with, done to the best of my ability at that moment in time, and then moved on. The things that I regret are things I've held on to, thinking I was going to do something else with them, and they never get done.
That's about not being a perfectionist, really, isn't it?
Yeah, really, absolutely. And I think a lot of us, especially women, are perfectionists early on in their career because they think every single thing has got to be just perfect, as if you're living in a goldfish bowl. The interesting thing is at this end of my career, I can look back and think that wasn't significant. I could have just moved through the things that I was finding really difficult to make perfect. And I could have moved on quicker and probably in a more interesting way, not thinking everything had to be absolutely ideal.
I wondered, I've been thinking about being brave, and sometimes I think perhaps we just do things and actually it's on reflection we realise that we've been brave. I don't know if that resonates with anyone else.
Yeah, sometimes you don't. Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. You don't necessarily go into a situation thinking, right, I'm going to be brave here and I'm going to do X, Y, Z. It's exactly that. You sometimes look back on a particular meeting or situation or HR issue or whatever it is, and then think, actually, yeah, that was quite, and like you say, it's sort of how one interprets the term brave. But I think, as you say, sort of questioning the norm. I think that's a really good point, actually. It's not always intended.
I think if you intend it too much, you work yourself up into more of an anxious state. If you feel like, oh my goodness, I've got to really be on perfect tip-top form, and you get anxious about that and you go into a meeting. But Louise knows that, she and I actually have a very good way of working events and meetings. We divide people up and say, we'll go over here and do this part of the room, or we'll meet this type of person, or these people on the attendee list. We know we need to land those. We've got quite a good sort of tag team approach to it. And it's quite fun doing it with colleagues. But it's something I force myself to do when I go to events anyway. I know what I want to get out of them, and I know if people are interesting, I give them time, because just like Marcella, you never know where it's going to end up.
Well, I quite agree with that, because it was our dividing and conquering it. I think it was the Whiskers, and you said, you've got to meet this fantastic lady, Marcella. And here we are.
That's right.
That's so good. But it does come back to the point you made earlier about being prepared, doesn't it? So that being prepared, that confidence that gives you, if you have got something that's making you a bit anxious or nervous about doing it. I love that.
That is true, actually, because just thinking on the events piece, that whole networking, and you can think, oh, I'm quite confident, I'm happy chatting to people, but actually and it's something actually that you've talked a lot about, Eunice, about that, the preparedness. So now if I'm going to events, whether it's a conference or whatever, trying to spend as much time as possible looking up who's going to be there, which institutions, which job roles are they in, what kind of campaign, from a Marcoms perspective, so when you're meeting someone, they say, oh, I'm from the University of X. It's so lovely to be able to say, oh yes, I've seen your latest work on X, because it just helps, doesn't it? And so I always think, or certainly my younger self, I would have thought, oh, I can just go in a room, no problem, I'll talk to anyone. But then I'd find myself going, all right, what's that? I don't know who that is, or what's that? Whereas now I sort of take the time to prepare before going to sort of schmooze and chat to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also, I think what you've got really good at is afterwards dissecting, who we met, how we might invite them to the University of Chester, what we might do with the information that we gained, etc., what we learned. And I think that's also massively useful, because I think COVID made us realise what an effort it is to go to some of these live events. You get up at the crack of dawn, you get on the train, you might have to change trains, you finally get there, you do the event, and then you have to get all the way home again. And actually, there's a lot of energy expended compared to just doing this, very nice webinar. So I still love live events, but it's made me realise that you need to get as much out of them as possible.
I really like that idea of having a debrief on your
Yeah.
efforts.
Mm.
Because we're all brave and we all bring ideas and we all have things that we want to achieve. But how often do we look back and kind of measure the success or impact
Yeah.
of what we've done and think, actually, I'm going to do that a bit differently, even if we got a
Yeah.
no or we didn't get the
Yeah.
result that we wanted. Um, that time for
Mm.
reflection.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
Louise, you've spoken very highly of Eunice working closely together, and I can see, Eunice, that you really champion the women you work with and support them in your role at Chester. Have any women stood out to you in your career that have been a cheerleader for you?
I've had a lot of women who have that I've learned from who have supported me for sure a lot. So a master's tutor, for example, she had a first class degree. She started up this new program, but she was never going to get promoted because again, she hadn't produced enough to get through that barrier to promotion to professor. And I learned a lot from that, where I thought she's being misjudged by the criteria that are being used, because actually she was one of the strongest members of the team. So I learned from her. But I've also learned from other enthusiastic people who have made me realize that you can carve out an independent career for yourself. You just don't be boxed into anyone else's assumption set. And that's been really useful.
Would you be able to expand on that a bit more? I'd be really interested to hear an example of maybe somebody that has had an assumption and how you kind of keep yourself out of what you think other people think of you.
Well, I said I did residential wardening, and that was literally living in and being responsible for the sort of care and discipline of the students, and 300 and something of them. And I learned so much because I was only in my 20s. Gosh, I learned so much from that job. And eventually, actually, when I got married, my husband and I lived in for a year because we had a prem baby. And so it was a very nice opportunity just to take stock before we sort of got into the whole house thing. Why am I telling that? Because it made me appear as if that was a huge part of my identity, I guess, because I was pretty well known across this college in that capacity. And an academic who I did rate, he'd gone abroad to do his social science research in Africa or wherever. And he came back, and I remember him saying, "Thank you so much for holding the fort while I was gone," or something. And then I knew he was on track to become a professor because he was writing up this research, etc. There was no way the job I was doing was going to get me on track to anything like that. And the penny dropped, and I suddenly thought, he's assuming that I'm a Care Bear, that's what I want to do with the rest of my life, is be in a caring role and support the students in an institution. And he turns up to teach eventually when it suits him. It's really interesting. So that made me realize that how I was being viewed, even though I was just as well qualified as him.
And I also, I worked in the city a long time ago and something similar. And actually, that thing around caring, I know I was the person that made everything function, but my colleague who was a guy, he was the one who kind of took on the interest in projects and recognition. It's really interesting, isn't it, how that happens to particularly to women, I think, in that situation.
For sure. That's very, very common, I think, and there's nothing wrong with having a personality where caring is part of it. It's a great part of it. But it doesn't mean that is you in that box, in that stereotype for all of your career.
No, it's about taking that, isn't it? And taking that part, but not being kind of labelled it as
I think we can all agree at the moment it's quite a turbulent time in the sector. And a question I really wanted to ask was how you're balancing leading your teams in the here and now, but also thinking about future growth and your own role within the future. I think it'd be really useful for people to understand that, because I certainly kind of get that feeling from people that I speak to at universities.
And it is difficult because people are reconfiguring their teams in professional services in the academy. So everybody is feeling a little bit vulnerable, I think. And so the business as usual is incredibly important. So, through Louise, we put out the positive stuff that is going on. I mean, I'm sitting here in Chester Business School, and we've got 1,000 new students coming across this one and the faculty across the river in Health Medicine Society. So they literally landed in the last week, and they're being inducted and they're having lectures today. So, there's a lot of regular business that is happening that needs to be just as good as ever or better than last year. So in my feeling is just keeping the channels open with staff. So I'm pretty accessible to staff, I would say. I communicate almost weekly in a blog format, but I'm also around lots of campuses, so I sort of try and get out and about as much as I can. And I think that's really important in a time of change, is just to be obviously there, even if what I have to say to people isn't what they absolutely want to hear. So when people say this university is rubbish at communicating, not that they've said that to me recently, but they might do, it's often because they didn't want to hear what we were saying. So rubbish at communication is actually, they're giving me communications which I think are rubbish because they might affect me. Yeah.
Difficult, isn't it? Louise is our comms expert, and there's a difficult task to navigate.
It is, and I think everyone that knows me, I've always been a glass half full kind of gal, but you've also got to be a realist, and you have to have emotional intelligence and empathy and understand if people are sort of struggling with what's next, and what's the next 3, 6 months, years, whatever they're going to look like. But actually, I think, I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think what we've tried to do is focus on that growth mindset and opportunities, and that should really play in, I think, to, and hopefully is, to colleagues across the sector in Marcoms, that there is a sense of the opportunity, I suppose, to sort of try and make a difference and think a bit differently, and how we can navigate, especially for me in comms, the sort of the rhetoric that's out there about higher education. So any opportunities, I think, to showcase how great universities are, for me, that's definitely what I'm trying to sort of cling on to and push out through the teams about, there's this great win, and there's this great student story, or whatever it is, because it's so easy, isn't it? And it's really easy to get demoralized when you hear all this doom and gloom about higher ed. And actually, I think, no, I feel like my job's to go, no, actually that's not right, so I'm being brave by trying to shout about how great it is. So that's certainly my kind of thoughts on certainly from a comms perspective in this sector. I don't know what your thoughts are, Simone, as the marketing guru.
I think it's very similar. I think what I've been thinking about is that thing about being visible. So most of us are managers, and we might be a junior manager, a really senior manager, but I think that thing about being visible and that reassurance that you're there is really, really important. So
I also, coming back to that impression of higher education, in doom and gloom sort of situation, it's interesting how local that is. That's UK focused. That's UK higher education, much as in the last Westminster government, they were always knocking HE. When you go abroad and you talk about British higher education, it's incredibly well regarded still. They almost ignore the politics, because lots of countries have difficulty funding their higher education systems, however developed the country is. And so I think we just need to take pride in UK higher education per se, and be proud to be a part of that. And then for our UK students, try and relay that message.
I agree that all universities have amazing stories to tell, and that positivity goes a long way for yourself and internally your colleagues as well. You reminded me of something my CEO said to me a couple of weeks ago. He commented on my calmness as a leader. And I think if I spoke to my wife or my friends, they'd probably laugh if they heard me being called calm. But I think something I really tried to focus on over the years is being present and calm, and even if there's times where you are flappable, not showing it or not giving it any time in your own head, because it's quite difficult to make decisions under pressure if you are feeling anything but calm.
And I think you have to sometimes park your emotions about it. I can go off like a rocket as much as anybody when I see something that really frustrates me or makes me mad. But that's no good. That's no good for my team. It's no good to progress the matter. Whatever the matter is, probably needs, as you say, cool, calm attention rather than emotion. I think you have to actually practice doing that. because especially for an extrovert person, you might always express things verbally instantly without really even thinking about it. And it does take a little bit of practice to just hold yourself in a bit and, almost get mad inside and then be more reflective.
I think
Impulse control. It's definitely.
I think Teams is quite humbling for that, because sometimes you catch yourself looking at yourself and your face gives a lot away, doesn't it? I mean,
For sure.
But yeah, no, completely agree. And generally speaking, if you look calm and your body language is calm, you are calm. So it's got the kind of knock-on effect. Um, it's been an amazing conversation, Eunice, and we're all very inspired by your journey. And as I said, I've really loved building a relationship with you over the years and the time that you've given to me. A question we all wanted to ask you was, what advice would you give to somebody that does have an idea or has a big ambition? How can they be brave and get heard?
I think they need to understand the context in which they're working. So a lot of my naivety at the beginning of my career held me back, because I didn't really understand the power structures in universities. I didn't really understand the promotion criteria, all of that. And I sort of got onto that later on. And I think it's interesting, I'm involved in a Chester Women in Leadership initiative to actually support women across the city with several other fantastic chief executives. Chester is a women-led city, it has to be said. There's been a whole revolution. And we found exactly the same thing. We're mentoring 16 people, middle managers. Doesn't matter what sector they're from. I've mentored 2 this week in banking and charity sector. They're coming up against that same feeling of they don't quite understand how to get to the next step. But when I've asked them, do they know their HR policies, for example, or do they know something, how to do something? They don't necessarily. And they don't quite understand how to navigate their own work context. And I'd say 2 things: learn the stuff on the web about your company and all the ways of doing things, but also look at how colleagues have done it and see if you've got somebody slightly ahead of you that you can try and mirror their track as well. And really ask and say, I would like to be such and such in 2 years' time. How could I get there?
Thank you so much. That's brilliant advice. And I think, certainly from my experience, when you do ask somebody that has done well and gone on an upwards trajectory, they're often very willing to share and give advice, which you wouldn't get if you don't ask.
Yeah, that's true. And sometimes it's not even necessarily within your own immediate piece, because I know years ago, I had a manager who was very good at keeping a lid on everything. And I was so eager. I was like, oh, I have a really good idea about this. And it was a sense of, don't undermine me. You do this. And I just happened to have an opportunity to speak to someone in a different team about an idea. And they were like, oh, that's brilliant. And they were more senior. And long story short, it sort of got evolved. And I never would have done that directly or intentionally through fear of undermining my manager, but actually it then enabled me a bit of an escape route because it ended up sort of way. So sometimes it's a really good point, Marcella. It's about speaking to other people, and sometimes those that aren't necessarily in your direct, you can sometimes feel frustrated, can't you, in your own team, but there might be opportunities elsewhere to share.
It comes back to that sort of informal mentor, doesn't it? So it's really good in terms of, I've loved hearing about how you're mentoring all those women, but sometimes we need to find our own mentors, don't we? And that actually really kind of resonates with that. That's very interesting.
And you have to ask people whether they're willing to mentor you. I think that's important. So quite a lot of the mentoring I've done over the years has literally just been on ad hoc, rather than, this is wonderful being part of a group with, chief executives, leader of council, head of business banking at Lloyd's, for example. That's a lovely group of women. But actually, I've done an awful lot of this just ad hoc, meeting a few times, trying to establish ground rules, and then just watching somebody develop. It's wonderful. It gives back to the mentor as well as helps a mentee, hopefully.
Yeah, that success when you see the person you've been mentored, when you see them succeed, is really makes you proud, doesn't it?
Thank you so much, Eunice. It's been a wonderful conversation. I know that our listeners will take a lot from that, as we have. hopefully we can get you as a guest on again in the future and follow your
Mhm.
journey. But for now, I just want to say a massive thank you, all the best at your position at Chester, and your time has been really valued.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Marcella, and good luck to the She Network.
Thanks so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So thank you, listeners. You've been listening to the She Network, a network by women for women working in higher education, marcoms and creative services. We're here to support and share our experiences, and we want to hear from you. So please let us know what you thought of today's webinar, what future topics you'd like us to talk about, and also if you'd like to take part. Wishing you all a great rest of the week, and we hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.